Teachers who have taught future major criminals, what were they like when they were under your tutelage? I was a grad student and teacher at Virginia Tech when Suho Cho barricaded himself in Norris Hall. When he was in class, the guy didn't speak. Never. Not one word. Don't get me wrong, I have silent students every semester. Some people just don't talk in class, but they still respond with facial gestures. Cho made no facial gestures like smiling or moving his eyebrows to reflect the thought he was having. He didn't look bored or embarrassed because that entails a facial gesture. Dude didn't even yawn. Now, try to imagine doing that. 4.5 months, not speaking, and no facial gestures. I imagine this would take some degree of effort, meaning you'd have to try to maintain a state of non-expression. When I think about undertaking this feat, I imagine I would begin to feel exhausted from not expressing my thoughts or emotions. I don't even think I could make it 4.5 days, let alone months. After all the years since the shooting, this is the thought I'm left wondering about the most. Even more strange was that it was a creative writing class, meaning the point was to bring your own writing, in this case, scenes from a stage play, and talk about other students' writing. It wasn't a core curriculum, it was optional. So Cho basically elected to place himself in a class where he'd be expected to speak and provide feedback. But he just sat in class with a baseball cap pushed down to semi-hide his face and watched. If you asked him a question, he just stared back, no words, no facial expressions. That video he mailed out to news stations before the incident, that was the most any of us in the English department heard him speak. As for his plays, the best I can describe it is weird. One scene I remember was of a son furiously accusing his father. The dialogue was like, "How dare you, father? You touched my mother, shame." Just weird stuff. I think some people have even performed Cho's plays and put them on YouTube. Story 2. I've had a handful of students go to jail for crimes they committed. Most cases were gang-related and some were substance deals gone bad. I've had a handful of students get popped. One of my seniors was wiped out earlier this year in an incident outside of a bar. His mother called him to help her in a fight with the owner. He got into a violent exchange with the owner. His mother survived, but he didn't. That one really hurt. All of these students were good kids in class. They were never disrespectful towards me. They did their work. They gave me hugs, smiled good morning, and told me their hopes and dreams. However, I know they live in one of the most violent communities in America. I can't allow what they do outside of my classroom to impact what happens in my classroom. It's just not my place to judge them. I know many of my students are involved in gangs and substance dealing, and these incidents will continue to happen. It's just a heartbreaking reality I've had to come to accept. My job is to teach them not only my subject area, but also to teach them the basic life skills they need to survive. Their home lives are often out of control. They're scared to walk home from school, and I'm not naive enough to think that weapons are not sometimes hidden away in backpacks. I try to show them love and provide them with a place they feel safe and supported. And for every child who has passed away or offed another, there are so many more who have gone on to do truly amazing things. We have numerous Gates Scholarship winners, and one of my students last year earned a full ride to Stanford. My students are kind and brilliant. They're also terrified, live in abject poverty, and have to fight for their futures. Sometimes they lose the fight and people pass away. Now, I want to be clear, I have never once felt afraid of my students. I love teaching here. They call my mom. They tell me they love me. I go to weddings, baby showers, and grieve with them at funerals. I would not want to work anywhere else. Now that's a really amazing and respectable attitude to have. I wish there were just more teachers like this one. Story 3. I teach music, so I see a lot of kids for a short time each week. My current school has everything cut so far to the bone. I see them 30 minutes once a week. My first assignment was inner city kids, but the kids had music twice a week for 45 minutes each. Better schedule, but the kids were in a far worse place. I'll save the whole poverty, neglect, cruel cycle that is a factor in almost all of these stories, and I'll mention the 3 students from that school who are now in prison for the heinous crime they committed. The first to go was a kid I had as a 6th grader. He was either emotionless or angry all the time, and was always looking to start a fight. Unlike others, he'd fight without any visible emotion other than extreme concentration on making sure his punch did damage. A few years later, he appeared on the news after being denied entry into a nightclub. People were congregating out front when he and some cronies pulled a drive-by. He fired into the crowd and ended a local newspaper reporter. His face on TV at the arraignment showed fear for the first time. He He was 16 at that time. The other two managed to make it well into their 20s before pulling the trigger on their victims. Both were defiant, angry kids who felt entitled to everything. They were jerks, and the school system had them in and out of intervention. Ultimately, though, this falls back on parents, in my opinion. The latter of these two actually had his dad nearly jump me at bus duty one day. The kid had been suspended for hitting another kid with a chair. The dad jumped in my face because I was, quote, disrespecting the boy. He has every right to attack anybody he wants to get what he wants. Never forget that, you racial epithet aimed at whites. I let it go, but I was nervous. In hindsight, if my younger self had the experience of my current self, I would have pressed charges on the guy. Maybe that would have at least started sending a message. We knew some of these kids would turn out to be drains on society, but we never expected them to go so far as taking someone else's life. And the clincher? Back then, I never had the support of the school because there were terrible allegations of bigotry in other buildings, and they did not want to get involved. So a lot of African American students, without the boundaries set for non-minority students, brought their rage to the classrooms every day. And that's how I believe the schools failed them. We set a different standard for African American kids, which insinuated the law of unintended consequences. What was designed to make them feel more important and respected not only did the opposite, it provided them an easy way to lash out at pretty much anyone they wanted to target. And the scariest part of all of this, in my current job, I see more and more kids falling back into this pattern. Kids as young as first grade, kids who are not members of a racial minority either. Now, doing my best to be a positive influence, 1/2 hour at a time, once a week. Story 4. This experience had an immense impact on my professional career. So let me preface this with the typical, I wasn't a teacher, but I was a program lead for an after-school program, so I taught curriculum and supported day school programs. I was working at the middle school that I had attended. A big problem to me was the school focused on underperforming and at-risk students and almost ignored the higher-performing students. Being that I was one of those high-level students and this was my first job, I was a junior in high school when I started, I wanted to put my attention into students that were like me. Obviously, this didn't happen and I had a chip on my shoulder. The student who got on my nerves the most was Johnny. Johnny was a thug, a pure and simple, no respect for anyone in the classroom, would be disruptive and challenging even when other kids were enjoying the session. I mean, in one class I taught, it was simply playing Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh!, eventually even D&D. Johnny would steal cards or destroy them. We'd call his mother on him, and it was the same thing. Not my chili, you all just picking on him. Every time he'd get to the point where we needed parental intervention, this was the only response she'd give. In my 1 year of experience, I decided I was just done with this kid. If he was assigned to one of my classes, I'd just sit him in a corner and not allow him to participate. Remember, I was a senior in high school at this point. He was in 8th grade and I had no support system. I regret this decision to this day. As time went on, I became a better teacher. I later had 2 different students who were diagnosed by the district psychologist as sociopaths. While working with the first one was difficult and a learning experience, I learned that I actually enjoyed working with the difficult students. I developed techniques and rapport with troublemakers to where when I had the second sociopath, he was like any other student in my classroom. He was behaved for me where he wouldn't for anyone else. Then it all changed. First thing in the morning, my mom wakes me up to watch the news. There was an incident next to my grandmother's house, and my uncle was going to be on TV. Sad, but neat. Then they update the report by saying there was one demise, a childhood friend of mine. My sister's very first boyfriend, actually. And we were devastated. It was a carjacking gone wrong, thought to be a gang initiation. I followed the news all day. I wanted to know if the jerk who did this was caught. I imagined the dude getting eliminated by the police. Instead, they found him cowering in a backyard with a wallet of one of the people he robbed. That night, the evening news reported on the suspect in custody. It was Johnny. After Johnny was arrested, I couldn't work with kids like I used to. That second sociopath I excelled with, I had nightmares of him hurting my family. When I went to my supervisor, the after-school principal, saying I needed extra help or support after what happened, she just said I was being dramatic. The incident happened in October of 2006, and by April 2007, I was gone. I just couldn't handle it. 2 years later, I went to trial for a whole week, and he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In that time, I gave up on education and got a job working in natural resources that ended up being my current career. I don't love it like I did teaching, but it pays the bills and supports my wife and kids. All right, so please do consider PTSD counseling. This type of experience is profound and it is worth it to work it out in your mind. Far too many folks scoff at the self care aspect of the trauma those who work with children and teens go through. On a lighter note, please also don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. It helps keep me going and it helps keep the channel going. So thanks in advance for that. Let's get back to the videos. Story 5. I'm a teacher now. However, I wasn't a teacher when this happened. I was working at a juvenile detention center, which they were saying was a treatment center. We were not a facility that held major offenders. Now, one kid was in there for getting caught with some grass. He was in for like 3 to 6 months, which was harsh for a first time offender. But the judge was notorious for this kind of thing. We had kids from that area who were sent to us after skipping school a few times. And he was really mellow, liked to play card games, and was very mature. When the younger kids would be starting fights or bickering, he would always distance himself and just sort of remove himself from everything. A year after he left us, he was caught trafficking serious amounts of narcotics. He was sentenced to something like 20 years for that and the various offenses which led up to him getting caught. Anyway, this was in Wyoming in 2014-15. It was going on for longer, but that was when I was there. I went to college originally to be a juvenile defense attorney and worked in Boston's court systems for a while, and I'm aware of how juvenile court works. In Wyoming, we just don't have that great of a system. There is a pretty set standard for punishment along the board, except with this one judge who was overly harsh and her punishment was always our facility first if we had the beds. That's why we all thought it was strange, and we did send a bunch of paperwork and numbers to child services, which got our facility shut down. It didn't affect her that I know of. The supervisor in charge of reporting it and who had the copies ended himself 3 years ago, so I'm not exactly sure what kind of investigation could be done now. Our facility got axed and it was a corrupt place itself. I know the judge's name, but who knows if she was really in on some corruption. She could totally just be relentless and think that our treatment center was what these kids needed. It's just strange that it was always our center and not another place unless there were no beds. Story 6. Every job I've had, I've worked with kids all the way from my first high school job to my current career. I've always had great sympathy for the troubled and outspoken kids because I knew their behavior stemmed from something greater. Now, these are the kids I paid extra attention to and was always sure to give them tasks I could give them positive feedback for and give them praise when I could. When they showed misconduct, I would sit down with them and talk to them about their actions and how it affected others. I didn't see them as bad kids. I just saw them as children with some sort of void in their life who just needed someone to care. I almost always saw a change in their personality in the day or week or so I had them. It's been a couple of years now, but I substitute taught in a very rural and poverty-stricken school. No respect for authority or even themselves. Completely wild and out of control, but at the core, I saw them as a type of child I described above. My first day was in a first grade class, and when I signed in at the front, the entire office staff was apologizing for putting me in this class. Within the first hour, this one particular boy had pulled a girl out of her chair by her hair, jabbed a boy with a pencil, and had bullied several students to the point of crying and had left a note on my desk calling me names. At the playground and PE, he started fights. He was tormenting his classmates just because. First grade. I tried all my usual tricks on him, but he was relentless. He seemed different than the other children that were troublesome. He felt dark and sinister to the core, and honestly, it scared me. Weeks passed, and I was scheduled to sub for that class again. I had a pit in my stomach and felt sick all night and morning because my previous experience had been so bad. When I walked in the class, I realized he was absent and honestly felt relieved. One of the teachers told me later that his mom was a junkie, no surprise there, and tried to make it over the tracks while a train was coming and got hit. He was in the car. I still to this day don't know if he passed away or was only injured, but I remember even in that particular moment thinking that all of the kids it could have happened to, I was glad it was him. I even thought him passing away could actually save a life. The class that day was peaceful and joyful. The kids got to act like kids. They showed me their drawings, they tattletaled, they gave me hugs, they pouted over trivial things. I felt like how a first grade class is supposed to feel like, all because the one bad egg was gone. Isn't it amazing the difference a single student can make? And bravo on understanding troubled kids early on. Story 7. He was an instant criminal. A new boy was placed in my class. He had a twin sister in another class, and he was very bright but super quiet. He kept to himself and didn't interact with other students. On a Friday afternoon before the end of the day, he went after a girl in the school toilets. This girl looked just like his twin. It was messed up. The school covered up the whole incident to avoid negative publicity and protect both kids' identities. I'm not sure if charges were pressed and was only made aware of it because I happened to be on site and near another senior staffer when she took the call and freaked out. I received a phone call the next day telling me not to discuss it. I don't know what happened to the boy or whether it was the first time such an incident had occurred. The student he went after moved interstate, but then eventually returned to school where she struggled with the incident, although it was literally never mentioned after the day it happened. I only remembered this because I had been rereading an old diary and I wrote about it in there. Story 8. I had a group of students that I was very close to. They were all in a gang, what they called the Faux Deuce 4-2 gang. It was a local member of the Crips. Two of them in particular I took particular interest in. Having them in my home for dinner once a week, tutoring them every day after school for all other subjects. I picked them up for school and dropped them off every day. I got them both jobs and drove them to work. They had pretty violent backgrounds, but I trusted them. They were like my own children before I had my own actual children. Unfortunately, things started going downhill with the older one. He stole a lot of valuables from my wife, then refused to acknowledge he had done anything wrong since he said he needed it more than we did since his lights were off. I put up a pretty strong boundary with him after that, and he stopped coming around as much and started walking to school again, which means he didn't come very often. The other student, X, had a horrible home. No parents, grandma couldn't really take care of him, siblings in jail or on substances, etc. I offered to let him live with us for a few months for some reason that I can't remember now. I know it sounds stupid, but that actually worked out. He never took from us. He was always grateful. His grades went up a bit. He even got jumped out of his gang after I asked him to. It really was a nice beginning. After 4 to 6 months into him living with us, we were watching The Office and he was laughing really hard at some joke when all of a sudden he stopped laughing, got this real somber look, then got up, went to his room and wouldn't talk to us. He got up the next morning and told us he wanted to move out. At first, he wouldn't tell me why, and after a while of pressing him, he said he felt guilty enjoying life while his sister had to live back with his grandma. He felt he was ready to take care of her, and no amount of me trying to convince him he had to take care of himself first would dissuade him, so he moved out the following week. After he graduated the next year, I changed schools and slowly lost contact with him. He got fired from his job for no call, no showing 3 times in a month. I got him another job, but the same thing happened. Finally, we just lost touch, and this was about 7 years ago or so. About 7 months ago, I got an email from a lawyer. He tells me that his client asked him to get in contact with me. It's X. He'd been convicted for a crime he did. There's a news article on it, but I don't think I should post it, even though it's public record and all. But he basically walked into a room, offed a guy he had no beef with for no discernible reason to anyone, then walked out without robbing him. I was and am pretty upset about it. Part of my feelings revolve around sadness, obviously, but there's also guilt for not getting it right or saying the right things or whatever. I knew he had violent tendencies, but I saw a non-violent side of him who liked Michael Scott and cooking. I had hoped that the better angels of his nature would win out, but obviously they didn't. I'm not sure I could have done anything different, and in some ways, the experience has embittered me about the ability of people to be saved, although I don't think that word fits exactly. I definitely won't take those extreme measures again, partly because it seems like it was all for naught, and partly because I think it was riskier than I realized at the time. Alright, so this guy went far above and beyond the call of duty for both of those kids. I understand and I feel for that guilt, but hopefully he understands that he shouldn't feel guilty. No one could have done any more than he already did. Alright, so if you've liked these stories and were touched or moved by any of them, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this one. So I'll catch you in that video, and a big thank you for hanging out with me on this one.